He's flanking you, LT. If I don't take the shot, Miller dies in 4 seconds.
Check your fire, Viper. That is a direct order.
3 seconds. 2 seconds. 1.
Check your fire, Viper. That is a direct order. The voice in her earpiece cracked, distorted by the static of jamming signals and the sheer panic of the lieutenant. Sergeant Elena Vance didn't blink. Her heart rate was a steady 45 beats per minute, a ghost in the machine. Through the scope of her SR-25, the world was reduced to math: windage, elevation, the Coriolis effect, and the terrified face of a ranger pinned down 300 meters below. "He's flanking you, LT," Elena whispered, her voice devoid of the fear that was eating the platoon alive. "If I don't take the shot, Miller dies in 4 seconds. We need a PID. We are in a no-fire zone. Stand down." 3 seconds. She adjusted the turret. The target was a shadow amidst shadows, holding an RPG aimed squarely at the cluster of rangers huddled behind a crumbling mud wall. If she fired, the muzzle flash would light her up for every insurgent on the ridge. She would be the beacon, the martyr. 2 seconds. "Vance, don't you do it. Don't you dare." 1. Elena exhaled, emptying her lungs, emptying her future. Crack. Transmission cuts to static. 18 hours earlier, forward operating base, Anvil. Yes, the cargo hold of the MH-47 Chinook smelled of hydraulic fluid, stale sweat, and the sharp metallic tang of anxiety. It was a smell Staff Sergeant Elena Viper Vance knew well, but tonight it felt heavier, thicker. She sat near the rear ramp, her SR-25 semi-automatic sniper rifle cradled between her knees like a fragile child. The interior of the helicopter was bathed in a dim red light, turning the faces of the 20 men of Ranger Platoon Echo 4 into gargoyles. They were checking gear, bumping fists, chewing tobacco, a tribe, a brotherhood, and she was the intruder. "Check your spacing, boys. We're heavy tonight." Lieutenant Kalen's voice cut through the internal comms, clear and commanding. He didn't look at Elena. He hadn't looked at her since the briefing at FOB Anvil. "Intel says the target is in the compound at Grid 44 Bravo. Standard snatch and grab. Fast, violent, home for breakfast." "Hoo-ah!" the platoon responded in unison, a low rumble that vibrated through the airframe. Elena adjusted the strap of her helmet. She wasn't just heavy. She was, in Kalen's words from 2 days ago, a diversity hire aimed at ruining my unit's tempo. He had wanted another gunner. He got a female sniper from a special reconnaissance unit instead. "Hey, Viper!" a voice crackled in her ear. It was Corporal Miller, the youngest of the bunch, sitting opposite her. He gestured to her rifle. "You sure you can lug that thing up the goat trail? It's a steep climb. We don't stop for breathers." Elena looked up. Her eyes were hidden behind the amber tint of her protective glasses. "Focus on your fast rope technique, Miller. I saw you stumble in rehearsals." A few chuckles rippled through the squad. Miller reddened, turning away. Elena didn't smile. She couldn't afford to. In this world, competence was the only currency, and she was starting with a debt she hadn't incurred. She ran a gloved thumb over the receiver of her weapon. The SR-25 was a precision instrument designed for surgical removal of threats from 800 meters. These Rangers were sledgehammers. They didn't understand the scalpel. The Chinook banked hard, the G-force pressing them into the nylon webbing of the bench seats. The pitch of the rotors changed, deepening as the pilot fought the erratic wind currents of the mountain range. 1 minute out, the crew chief signaled, holding up a single finger. The mood shifted instantly. The joking stopped. The chewing stopped. Safety latches clicked off. The red light turned to green. Elena stood up with them, her movements fluid. She checked the ranger in front of her, Sergeant Reyes. Her eyes narrowed. A strap from his rucksack was dangling loose, the plastic buckle unclasped. If that caught on the fast rope or a rock ledge, it would make a noise that could carry for a mile in this thin air. She reached out, grabbing his shoulder. Reyes spun around, aggression flaring in his eyes. "What?" he barked over the comms. Elena didn't speak. She pointed to the strap, then violently cinched it tight and snapped the buckle shut. She tapped his helmet twice. Good to go. Reyes looked at the strap, then back at her. The aggression faded, replaced by a begrudging nod. He turned back to the ramp. One small victory, Elena thought. 1,000 to go. The ramp lowered, revealing a swirling abyss of darkness and dust. The world outside was a monochrome, chaotic mess under night vision goggles, NVGs, shades of green and black, the Afghan borderlands. Go, go, go! The Rangers poured out, sliding down the ropes into the darkness. Elena waited for her slot. She was the eyes, not the entry team. She needed to be the last one off, to peel away and find the high ground while they kicked down doors. She grabbed the thick braided rope. The wind buffeted her, threatening to swing her like a pendulum. She locked her core, clamped her gloves onto the fiber, and slid. The landing was hard. The ground was uneven scree that shifted under her boots. She dropped to one knee immediately, weapon up, scanning. Echo 4, sound off. Kalen's voice was a whisper now. 1 up, 2 up, 3 up. Viper up, Elena said, her voice calm. Maintain interval. Viper, take rear security. Don't lag behind, Kalen ordered. Elena moved to the back of the formation. The valley was silent, too silent. There were no dogs barking, no distant hum of generators. Just the wind howling through the jagged peaks like a mourning mother. She scanned the ridgeline above them. It was perfect terrain for an ambush. High walls, narrow choke points. Lieutenant, Elena keyed her mic, breaking protocol. The village is dark. No ambient light. Local patterns suggest at least cooking fires this time of night. We have intel, Sergeant, Kalen snapped. They're keeping a low profile because the HVT is there. Keep moving. Elena tightened her grip on the pistol grip of her rifle. Intel is wrong, she thought. The silence isn't safety. It's a breath being held. She followed the Rangers into the mouth of the valley, the darkness swallowing them whole. The world under the glow of PBS 31 night vision goggles was a deceptive reality. Depth perception warped, shadows stretched like oil spills, and the ground became a monochromatic puzzle of phosphorescent green and black. Elena moved with the calculated slowness of a predator, placing each boot specifically to avoid the grinding crunch of loose shale. Ahead of her, the Rangers of Echo 4 were ghosts, their IR strobes blinking rhythmically on the crowns of their helmets, invisible to the naked eye, but beaming like lighthouses to anyone with similar tech. Pick up the pace, Echo. We are burning the clock, Kalen's voice hissed over the encrypted net. Elena frowned behind her goggles. They were moving too fast. The incline was 20 degrees steeper than the satellite imagery had suggested. At this speed, lungs burned, focus narrowed, and noise discipline eroded. She could hear the heavy panting of Private Miller ahead of her, the clack of a rifle barrel against a ceramic plate carrier. Control, this is Viper, Elena whispered, her voice barely registering on the comms. We are pushing too hard. The acoustic signature in this canyon is amplifying. Request we slow to a stalk. Negative, Viper, Kalen snapped back instantly. We have a capture window. Unless you see a target, stay off the net. Elena clamped her jaw shut. Capture window. It was a phrase used by officers looking at a timeline on a whiteboard, not the men hiking through enemy territory. The path narrowed, winding between two sheer cliff faces that blotted out the stars. It was a natural fatal funnel. If anyone was up there, Echo 4 was fish in a barrel. Elena scanned the ground. The trail was supposed to be an old smuggler's route, unused for months according to G2 intelligence. The dirt should have been hard-packed and windswept. She stopped. 3 meters ahead, the ghostly green image of the earth was disturbed. She crouched, signaling the ranger behind her to freeze. She toggled her IR illuminator, focusing the beam on the dirt. Fresh indentations, not the erratic hoofprints of mountain goats, and not the shuffled dragging of local shepherds in sandals. These were distinct, rhythmic depressions with aggressive tread patterns. Tactical boots. Hold movement, Elena commanded, her tone dropping an octave, authoritative enough that the squad instinctively froze before Kalen could countermand it. Status? Kalen demanded, his voice tight. Fresh tracks, Lieutenant, at my 12 o'clock, Elena murmured, keeping her eyes scanning the periphery. Combat boots, heavy loads, less than 2 hours old, heading towards the objective. Intel said this route was cold, Vance, Kalen argued, his frustration bleeding through. Probably border patrol or other smugglers. Smugglers don't walk in a patrol column, sir. They cluster. These are spaced out. It's a military formation. There was a pause. The silence stretched, filled only by the wind whistling through the rocks. Elena waited for the order to reevaluate, to perhaps flank wide or launch a drone to scout ahead. We're close to the objective, Kalen said finally. If there's a hostile element, they're likely already at the village. We stick to the plan. Viper, move up. Get eyes on the village. Echo, on me. Double time. Elena stared at the tracks for a second longer. He's ignoring the geometry of the battlefield, she thought. He wants the win so bad he's willing to bet our lives on probably. Copy, she replied, the word tasting like ash. She adjusted her rifle, shifting the weight of the SR-25. She moved past the squad, taking point to peel off toward the Overwatch position. As she passed Kalen, his face was a mask of green shadows, unreadable and rigid. She climbed higher, separating from the main element. Her breathing remained steady, a rhythmic in and out that slowed her heart. She was the outlier now, the lone wolf moving up the jagged ridgeline while the pack descended into the valley floor. The air grew colder as she ascended. The wind bit through her combat shirt. She reached a rocky outcrop that offered a view of the valley below. Then she heard it. Caw-caw. A sharp, piercing cry echoed off the canyon walls. Elena froze, melting into the shadow of a boulder. She listened. Caw-caw. It sounded like a raven, but ravens were diurnal. They didn't call out in the pitch black of a moonless night in the Hindu Kush, and they certainly didn't repeat the exact same pitch and interval twice in a row. Echo leader, this is Viper, she whispered, her thumb hovering over the push to talk. I have biologicals acting strange. Possible signal. You're jumping at shadows, Vance. Kalen's voice was dismissive, breathless from the hike. We have visual on the village. It's dead quiet. Get in position and provide cover. Elena looked down the scope. The village lay below, a cluster of mud brick squares huddled in the darkness. It looked like a graveyard. Copy, she said. But as she scanned the ridges opposite her position, the hair on the back of her neck stood up. The bird had stopped. Whatever made that sound wasn't flying. It was waiting. Elena lay prone on the rocky shelf, her body pressed into the freezing shale. She had become a part of the mountain, a breathing extension of the stone. Below her, 500 meters down the slope, the village of Almir sat in a bowl of darkness, a collection of geometric shadows against a lighter gray ground. She adjusted the focus on her spotting scope, flipping the toggle to thermal mode. The world in the lens shifted to a spectrum of white-hot and black-cold. Echo leader, this is Viper. In position. I have eyes on the objective, she whispered, her voice barely vibrating her throat mic. Copy, Viper. Scanning for sentries. Give me a sit rep. Kalen's voice came back, clipped and breathless. The main element of Echo 4 was moving through a dry wadi, approaching the village from the south. Elena panned the scope slowly from left to right, dissecting the village grid by grid. She looked for the telltale white glow of body heat, a sentry smoking a cigarette, a guard pacing a roof, a sleeping dog curled near a doorway. Nothing. The screen was a flat, dull gray. The village was dead. Leader, I have 0 biologicals, Elena said, a frown creasing her forehead. No sentries, no civilians, no livestock. They're hunkered down, Kalen replied instantly. Intel said the HVT travels with a heavy security detail. They're inside. Sir, I don't see goats, Elena insisted, her eye glued to the rubber eyepiece. In this region, every family has at least 2 goats or a donkey. They don't bring livestock inside the main living quarters. There isn't a single heat signature in the courtyards. The place is scrubbed. Maybe they moved them to the grazing grounds, Kalen dismissed. We are 3 mics from the breach point. Do you have PID on the target building? Elena shifted her aim to the largest structure in the center of the village, a 2-story compound with high walls. It was the only building emitting a significant heat signature. The windows were glowing with a faint, steady warmth, indicating activity inside. But something was wrong. She zoomed in. The heat blooming from the windows was perfectly static. Human heat signatures moved. They paced, they shifted, they clustered. This heat was a solid, unmoving block of white. It looked industrial, artificial. "I see the target building," Elena said, her pulse quickening, "but the thermal signature is odd. It's too consistent. It looks like ambient heating, not body heat." "Sir, I recommend holding at the perimeter. Send a drone to peek the windows." "We don't have time for toys, Viper. We're losing the darkness," Kalen snapped. "You're looking for ghosts. If the heat is on, they're home. Echo 4, prepare to stack." Elena pulled her eye away from the scope for a fraction of a second, looking at the silent village with her naked eye. The wind howled through the empty alleyways, a low moan that sounded like a warning. The hairs on her arms stood up. It wasn't just the cold. It was the biological imperative of prey sensing a predator. She felt the weight of the judgment against her. If she called a halt now and was wrong, she would be the scared girl who froze on the trigger. She would validate every whisper, every eye roll she had endured since joining the unit. But if she was right? "Lieutenant, please," she tried one last time, keeping her voice steady despite the adrenaline dumping into her blood. "This feels like a staging area. It's a textbook lure. Let me scan for IED indicators before you cross the threshold." "Negative. We are executing. Viper, cover the roof. If anything pops up, drop it." Elena watched through her scope as the Ranger squad emerged from the wadi. They moved efficiently, a serpentine line of green ghosts flowing toward the compound walls. They were professionals, lethal and fast. But from her vantage point, they looked fragile. Small figures moving on a game board someone else had designed. Kalen signaled the stack. 6 men moved to the heavy wooden door of the compound. Breaching charges were pulled from pouches. Elena scanned the perimeter of the door, her eyes darting frantically. The thermal overlay showed the heat of the Rangers stacking up. Then the clouds above shifted, allowing a sliver of unfiltered moonlight to strike the village. It was a momentary flash, a trick of the light. But Elena saw it. About 10 meters in front of the door, buried under a loose pile of trash and rubble, a thin metallic glint reflected the moon. It wasn't a wrapper. It was a taut line, running from the rubble pile directly into the foundation of the wall, a command wire. Her stomach dropped. The heat inside wasn't people. It was the ignition source, the bait. "Abort!" Elena screamed into the mic, shattering the radio silence. "Kalen, abort! It's rigged! There's a wire! Breach! Breach! Breach!" Kalen roared, overlapping her transmission. The breacher slapped the charge on the door. The detonator was already in his hand. "No!" Elena yelled, but the word was swallowed by the physics of the moment. The Rangers were committed. The decision had been made in the silence of the command tent days ago, and now the momentum of war was unstoppable. She watched the breacher's thumb move. It was too late for words. The distance between Elena's muzzle and the stack of Rangers was exactly 480 meters. At that range, a 7.62 millimeter match-grade round would take less than a second to arrive. In the scope, time seemed to liquefy. She saw the breacher's gloved hand tighten on the clacker, the firing device for the explosive strip adhering to the wooden door. She saw Kalen's mouth moving, shouting the final command. She saw the wire glinting in the dirt, a copper snake leading straight into the foundation of the house. They were 3 seconds away from vaporization. Her radio warning had been stomped on by Kalen's override. Screaming again was useless. Physics was the only language left. Elena shifted her aim. She didn't aim for the enemy wire. It was too thin, a thread in the dark. She didn't aim for the explosive charge on the door that would detonate it and kill them all. She aimed for the dirt 6 inches in front of the point man's left boot. "This ends my career," she thought. The thought was calm, cold, and final. "I will be stripped of rank. I will be discharged, but they will go home." She exhaled, the breath hissing out between her teeth, and squeezed the trigger. Thwip. The suppressed rifle coughed against her shoulder. The recoil was negligible, absorbed by her body mass. She didn't blink. She kept her eye open through the scope to spot the impact. Down in the valley, a puff of dust exploded at the point man's feet with a violent crack. The supersonic snap of the bullet passing close to them sounded like a whip crack from God. The reaction was instantaneous and chaotic. "Contact, front!" the point man screamed, throwing himself backward, away from the door. The stack collapsed. The Rangers, trained to react to incoming fire, scrambled away from the fatal funnel of the doorway, diving behind the low mud walls of the courtyard perimeter. The breacher dropped the detonator, rolling into the dirt. "Sniper! We are taking fire! 12 o'clock!" Kalen's voice tore through the comms, panic edging his tone. "Viper, do you have eyes on the shooter?" Elena bolted another round into the chamber, her heart hammering against her ribs. "I am the shooter, Lieutenant. Get away from the door. It is rigged." There was a moment of stunned silence on the net, the kind of silence that happens when reality fractures. "Say again?" Kalen's voice was low, dangerous. "You fired on your own element?" "Look at the rubble pile 10 meters out. Command wire. The building is a bomb," Elena shouted, abandoning protocol. "Pull back, now!" Kalen hesitated. From her perch, Elena could see him turn his head, looking toward the rubble she had called out. He was furious, his authority challenged in the most violent way possible. He raised his rifle, perhaps to verify, perhaps to curse her. But the enemy was done waiting. The silence of the village was shattered not by Kalen's order, but by a mechanical click from inside the target building. The world turned white. The target building, the two-story structure the Rangers had been seconds away from entering, didn't just explode, it disintegrated. The blast wave was a physical hammer. The roof lifted off in a single piece before shattering into timber and dust. A fireball rolled outward, consuming the courtyard where the stack had been standing moments ago. Because of Elena's shot, they were behind the perimeter wall. The wall absorbed the shrapnel and the heat, shielding the bodies of the men huddled behind it. The shockwave hit Elena's position on the ridge 2 seconds later, a gust of hot wind that rattled her optics. "Echo 4, status!" Elena yelled, scanning the dust cloud. Nothing but static. Then the ambush began in earnest. The empty ridges around the village, the ones Elena had scanned, suddenly lit up. Muzzle flashes sparkled like paparazzi cameras in the dark. The silence she had feared was replaced by the tearing sound of RPK machine guns. The enemy had been there the whole time, buried in spider holes, waiting for the Americans to enter the kill box. "Contact right, contact left." Someone was screaming on the radio. It sounded like Miller. "They're everywhere." Through the thermal scope, Elena saw the heat signatures of the enemy popping up from the ground. They were pouring fire into the courtyard where Echo 4 was pinned. "Viper, engage! Engage!" Kalen's voice returned, ragged and coughing. "We are pinned! Heavy fire from the East Ridge!" Elena didn't need the order. She was already working the bolt. She found a target, a machine gunner setting up on a rooftop overlooking the courtyard. She placed the crosshair on the glowing white shape of his torso. Breath out, squeeze. The gunner crumpled. But the geometry was all wrong. The Rangers were in the low ground. The enemy held the heights on 3 sides, and from the darkness of the ravine to the north, a terrifying sound cut through the gunfire. Whoosh! A trail of smoke spiraled through the air. An RPG-7 warhead aimed not at the Rangers, but at the only cover they had left. "RPG! Incoming!" Elena screamed. The warhead slammed into the mud wall shielding the squad. The explosion threw men like rag dolls, obliterating their cover and leaving them naked in the center of the kill zone. The valley floor was no longer a village, it was a cauldron. The RPG impact had kicked up a cloud of pulverized mud and debris so thick that the thermal optics on Elena's rifle washed out for a terrifying 3 seconds. Down in the kill zone, the radio was a cacophony of screams. "Medic! I need a medic up here! Check left! Check left! I can't see! My eyes!" Elena blinked hard, forcing her breathing to slow down. Panic was a contagion, and it was sweeping through Echo 4 faster than the shrapnel. Through the settling dust, her thermal sight began to resolve shapes again. The heat signatures of the Rangers were scattered, glowing white blobs writhing in the dirt. Some weren't moving. "Echo leader, report," Elena said, her voice cutting through the static. Silence. "Echo 2-1, report. she tried the platoon sergeant, Master Sergeant O'Neill. We're hammered. O'Neill's voice came back, high-pitched and breathless. Kalen is down. Blast trauma. He's unresponsive. We are taking effective fire from the east and north. We can't get heads up to return fire. Elena panned her rifle. The enemy wasn't just suppressing them, they were maneuvering. She saw 4 heat signatures detach from the ridgeline and begin sprinting down the slope toward the Rangers' blindside. They were closing the distance to throw grenades. 2-1, you have movers on your east flank. 50 meters in closing, Elena warned. I can't see them. The dust is too thick, O'Neill yelled. Suppressive fire! East! Spray it! The Rangers unleashed a wall of lead into the dust, but they were firing blind. Elena watched the tracers sail harmlessly over the heads of the insurgents, who dropped prone and continued to crawl forward. They were sharks circling a bleeding whale. Elena realized with a cold jolt that the chain of command had effectively decapitated itself. O'Neill was a brave soldier, but he was in the dirt, eating mud, his perspective limited to the 3 feet in front of his face. He couldn't see the chessboard. She could. Listen to me. Elena's voice dropped into the lower register, the voice of God tone she had practiced for close air support coordination. Stop firing blind. You are wasting ammo. 2-1, get smoke out. Red smoke. Mark your perimeter. We need fire support, not smoke. Throw the smoke, Sergeant, Elena barked. Throw it now or they will be on top of you in 10 seconds. There was a pause, then the hiss of canisters popping. Billowing clouds of red smoke erupted from the courtyard, masking the Rangers from the enemy's direct line of sight. It added to the confusion for the men on the ground, but for Elena, utilizing the thermal contrast, it created a distinct border. Okay, Elena whispered to herself. She shifted her aim to the lead insurgent crawling toward the smoke. I have the ball. Crack. The insurgent jerked and went still. Crack. The second one spun around, confused, trying to find where the death had come from. Elena put the next round into his chest before he could stand. 2-1, Elena relayed, working the bolt smoothly. Flank is clear for the moment. Drag the wounded to the south wall. It's the only hard cover left. Viper, we're combat ineffective. O'Neill coughed over the net. Kalen is bleeding from the ears. Miller has shrapnel in his leg. We need extraction. There is no extraction while that heavy machine gun is active, Elena said, panning her scope up to the hardened bunker on the opposing cliff. The PKM machine gun was chewing up the mud bricks of the south wall, keeping the Rangers pinned. Every time a Ranger tried to peek, the PKM hammered them back down. The enemy gunner was good. He was firing in bursts, changing his rhythm, and he was dug in deep behind sandbags and rock. Can you hit him? O'Neill asked, desperation creeping in. Elena ranged the target, 700 meters, high angle, crosswind gusting at 15 miles per hour. But the problem wasn't the shot. The problem was the angle. From her current hide site, the angle was too shallow. She was hitting the sandbags, not the gunner. Negative, Elena said. I don't have the angle. I'm deflecting off his cover. Then we're dead, O'Neill said flatly. If we move, he cuts us in half. If we stay, the mortars finish us. Elena pulled her eye from the scope. She looked at the terrain above her. There was a pinnacle, a jagged rock spire about 50 meters higher and exposed. If she climbed there, she would be looking down into the enemy bunker. She would have the shot, but she would also be silhouetted against the sky. The moment she fired, every gun in the valley would turn toward her. She looked down at the thermal cluster of Echo 4. They were huddled together, patching wounds, checking magazines. They were the same men who had laughed at her gear, who had rolled their eyes at her presence, and they were waiting for her to save them. 2-1, Elena keyed the mic. Prep the squad to move on my command. I'm going to silence the gun. Viper, stay in cover, O'Neill warned. If you move, they'll spot you. I know, Elena said, detaching her rifle from the tripod. She checked her magazine. 7 rounds left. Just be ready to run. She pushed herself up from the cold ground. The safety of the shadows felt like a physical weight she was shedding. She began to climb, her boots scraping against the unforgiving rock, moving toward the exposure that would likely be her grave. The climb was 50 meters of vertical hell. Elena moved with the desperate agility of a creature cornered. Her lungs burned in the thin mountain air, every inhalation tasting like crushed glass. The SR-25, usually an extension of her body, now felt like a lead anchor strapped to her back, the barrel digging into her spine with every reach. Below her, the battle was a rhythmic thumping of chaos. The PKM machine gun was still hammering the Rangers, a relentless chug, chug, chug that chewed through cover and morale alike. She could hear the screams over the radio, O'Neill calling for suppressing fire that wasn't coming, the distinct wet cough of someone choking on blood. "Viper status!" O'Neill's voice cracked in her earpiece. "Moving!" Elena gasped, not wasting breath on explanations. She reached for a handhold, her gloved fingers slipping on the frost-slicked shale. She dug her boots in, scrambling upward, showering loose rock down into the dark abyss. If she fell, she died. If she stopped, they died. The binary simplicity of the situation clarified her mind. She crested the spire. The wind up here was vicious, tearing across the exposed ridge at 20 miles per hour. There was no cover, no boulders, no depressions, just a flat slab of rock silhouetted against the lighter gray of the star-filled sky. She was a black cutout on a blank canvas. Elena dropped prone, slamming the bipod of her rifle onto the stone. She didn't look for cover, she looked for the target. Through the scope, the enemy bunker was now clearly visible below. From this height, she could see over the sandbags. She could see the gunner, a bearded man with a red scarf, his body jerking with the recoil of the heavy weapon. He was laughing. Elena reached for her Kestrel wind meter attached to her vest, checking the reading. Wind, full value left to right, 18 mph. Range, 740 meters. Angle, 15 degrees. She dialed the elevation turret on her scope. Click, click, click. She held for wind, shifting the crosshair to the left of the gunner's chest, aiming at empty space, trusting the physics to curve the bullet home. 2-1. Prep to move, Elena whispered, her heart rate forcibly slowed by a long, deep exhale. On my send. We can't move. The fire is too heavy. Trust me, Elena murmured. The world narrowed down to the reticle. The cold seeped into her bones, steadying her shaking muscles. The math took over. Windage, gravity, spin drift. It was all just numbers. She squeezed the trigger between heartbeats. Crack. The rifle bucked. Elena kept her eye open, tracking the trace. The bullet cut through the air, fighting the crosswind, arcing downward into the valley darkness. It struck the gunner in the neck. The man collapsed backward as if his strings had been cut. The PKM barrel pointed skyward, firing a final, harmless burst into the air before falling silent. The sudden absence of the machine gun's roar was deafening. "Go! Move! Move!" Elena screamed into the mic. Down in the dust, the Rangers scrambled. Free from the pinning fire, they dragged the wounded Kalin and the limping Miller across the open ground, diving into the cover of a dry irrigation ditch closer to the extraction zone. "We're clear! We made the ditch!" O'Neill shouted, relief flooding his voice. "Nice shot, Viper! That was—" "Get off the net!" Elena cut him off, working the bolt. She scanned the bunker again. The gunner was dead, but the movement had drawn attention. Next to the slumped body, a second figure appeared, a spotter with binoculars. He wasn't looking at the Rangers. He was looking up. He scanned the ridgeline, the binoculars sweeping past the rocks, past the shadow, until they stopped. They stopped exactly on the spire. Elena froze. Through her scope, she was looking directly into the lenses of the enemy spotter. He lowered the binoculars and pointed a finger straight at her. He shouted something back into the darkness of the trench line behind him. "I'm blown," Elena whispered to herself. A moment later, the ridge to her right erupted. It wasn't small arms fire this time. It was the thump, thump, thump of a DSHK heavy machine gun, 12.7mm rounds that could tear through a vehicle block, let alone a human body. The rocks around her exploded. Stone shards struck her helmet like hail. "Viper! They're shifting fire to you!" O'Neill yelled. "I know!" Elena gritted her teeth, curling into a ball as a round pulverized the rock inches from her face. "Get to the LZ! I can't hold this position!" She had bought them time, but the currency she used was her own invisibility. Now every gun in the valley knew exactly where the Angel of Death was perched, and they were intent on clipping her wings. The rock spire was disintegrating. The DSHK rounds were turning the granite cover into a shower of razor-sharp shrapnel, pinning Elena flat against the leeward side of the ridge. The dust choked her, coating her tongue with the taste of pulverized stone and cordite. "Viper! We are stuck!" O'Neill's voice was barely audible over the roar of the heavy machine gun above her. "We have 2 litter patients. We can't move fast." "Enough!" Elena risked a glance around the edge of the rock. Her thermal vision cut through the dust, and what she saw froze her blood. Down in the valley, 300 meters to the east of the Rangers' ditch, 3 heat signatures were frantically digging into the hard earth. One was kneeling, adjusting a heavy metal tube. Another was dropping a round down the spout. Mortars. "O'Neill, you have mortars setting up. Grid 44, Charlie. They have you bracketed," Elena screamed, keying the mic. "We can't suppress them," O'Neill yelled back. "We can't even lift our heads. If they fire, we're done." The Rangers were in a linear ditch. It was perfect cover from direct fire, but it was a death trap for indirect fire. An 82-millimeter mortar round landing in that ditch wouldn't just wound them. The confined space would amplify the blast pressure, liquefying organs. They would be dead before they heard the whistle. Elena looked at her rifle. The DSHK had her pinned. If she peeked to shoot the mortar team, the heavy machine gun would cut her in half. The enemy knew where she was, but they were treating her as a nuisance to be suppressed while they finished off the main force. She needed to change the equation. She needed to stop being a nuisance and become the primary threat. She needed to be louder, brighter, and more dangerous than the entire Ranger platoon. Elena reached into her vest and pulled out a small black box, a radio frequency decoy. She armed it, setting it to mimic the encrypted hopping signature of a platoon command node. She jammed it into a crevice in the rocks 10 meters to her left. Then she did the unthinkable. She reached for the end of her barrel. The suppressor was searing hot. Ignoring the heat radiating through her gloves, she depressed the locking lever and twisted. The heavy cylinder hissed as it detached. She shoved it into her dump pouch. Now her SR-25 was no longer a whisper. It was a cannon. 2-1, move your ass to the LZ now, Elena ordered. "I'm buying you the ticket." "Viper, what are you doing?" Elena didn't answer. She rolled out from behind the cover, exposing herself to the DSHK, to the mortars, to the entire valley. She raised the naked rifle. Without the suppressor, the muzzle flash would be a blinding fireball in the night, a beacon screaming, "Here I am." She aimed at the mortar pit. Boom! The sound was thunderous, shocking her own ears after hours of suppressed fire. The recoil was sharper, violent. A massive tongue of orange flame erupted from the barrel, lighting up the ridgeline like a flare. The mortar loader's head snapped back. He dropped the round. Boom! 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 Elena fired rapidly, abandoning the slow precision of a sniper for the aggressive cadence of a gunfighter. She put 3 rounds into the mortar pit, scattering the crew. The effect was immediate. The entire battlefield shifted. Every enemy fighter in the valley saw the muzzle flash. They saw the command node signal on their scanners. They stopped firing at the ditch. The DSHK gunner swung his barrel with renewed fury. The surviving mortar crew scrambled back to their tube, frantically cranking the traverse wheel. They weren't aiming at the Rangers anymore. They were aiming at the dragon on the ridge. "They're shifting fire," O'Neill shouted. "Go, go, go!" Elena saw the Rangers break from the ditch, sprinting toward the landing zone, their IR strobes bobbing in the dark. They were clear, but she was not. The air around her turned into a swarm of angry bees. Bullets cracked and zipped past her ears. She kept firing, keeping the attention on her, counting down the rounds in her magazine. Whoosh! A sound like tearing canvas filled the air. "Incoming!" Elena curled into a ball, pressing herself into the shallow depression of the rock shelf. Crump! The first mortar round landed 20 meters short, shaking the ground so hard her teeth rattled. Crump! The second round landed 10 meters long. They had her bracketed. "Walking it in," she whispered, her voice trembling. She scrambled backward, trying to slide down the reverse slope, but she wasn't fast enough. Crump! The third round hit the rock face 5 meters away. The blast wave picked her up and slammed her against the granite wall. A white-hot line of agony seared across her left shoulder, punching the breath out of her lungs. Elena gasped, her vision graying out. She reached for her shoulder. Her hand came back wet and slick. The tactical shirt was shredded, and underneath, the dark flow of arterial blood was pulsing in time with her fading heartbeat. She looked down at the valley. The Rangers were gone. The ditch was empty. She was alone, and the next round was already in the air. The world had narrowed down to a single, vibrating frequency. Ishuri, the tinnitus from the mortar blast, was louder than the wind, louder than the gunfire. Elena lay on her side behind the shattered remains of the rock spire. Her left arm was useless, a dead weight of agony hanging from her shoulder. The shrapnel had torn through the deltoid muscle and nicked something vital. The blood wasn't just oozing, it was pumping, dark and rhythmic, soaking into the dry Afghan dirt. "Stop the bleed," her training screamed. "Fight the shock." With trembling fingers, she fumbled for the cat tourniquet on her vest. Her right hand moved clumsily, slick with her own blood. She looped the nylon strap high up on her left arm, near the armpit, above the wound site. She bit her lip until it bled to keep from screaming as she twisted the windlass. One turn, the skin pinched. 2 turns, the muscle crushed against the bone. 3 turns, the flow stopped. She locked the rod in place and gasped, gray spots dancing in her vision. The pain was a blinding white light, but the cold clarity of survival washed over her. She wasn't dead yet. "Viper? Status?" The voice in her earpiece sounded like it was coming from underwater. It was. "O'Neill." Elena shook her head, trying to clear the cobwebs. She crawled back to her rifle. "Still. Here," she rasped. She looked through the scope. The thermal image was blurry, not the optic, but her eyes. She blinked hard. Below her, the enemy wasn't shelling anymore. They realized the sniper was wounded. They were smelling blood. A squad of 5 fighters was sprinting up the slope toward her position, moving in bounding overwatch. They were less than 100 meters away. If they reached the crest, they would execute her. More importantly, they would have a clear line of sight to the landing zone where Echo 4 was waiting. Then she heard it. The heavy, rhythmic whump, whump, whump of twin rotors beating the air. "Pale horse inbound. 1 minute out," the pilot's voice crackled over the net. The Chinook was coming, a massive, slow target. If the enemy fighters reached Elena's ridge, they would have a perfect top-down shot into the helicopter's engine exhaust with an RPG. "You can't land," Elena whispered. "Not yet." She pulled the rifle into her right shoulder, bracing the barrel on a rock because she could no longer support it with her left hand. She didn't have the stability for headshots. She aimed for center mass. Bang! The lead climber dropped. Bang! The second one dove behind a boulder, but she was firing too slow. The recoil was punishing her wounded shoulder, jarring the tourniquet. The remaining 3 fighters were closing fast, emboldened by her sluggish rate of fire. They were 40 meters out, 30. She could hear their voices now, shouting commands to flank her. She clicked the trigger. Click. Empty. She reached for a magazine, but her left hand wouldn't move. She couldn't reload. Not in time. The lead insurgent popped up, raising his AK-47 to spray her position. Elena dropped the rifle. Her right hand dropped from the weapon to the ground, searching for the plastic clacker she had staged when she first occupied the hide site. Defense in depth, she thought. Always have a backup. Her fingers found the cold plastic of the M57 firing device. She didn't look. She didn't need to. She knew exactly where she had placed the M18A1 Claymore mine, 10 meters down the slope, facing the approach path. "Front toward enemy," she muttered. She squeezed the clacker. Boom! The side of the mountain erupted. 700 steel ball bearings screamed outward in a 60-degree arc, shredding the air, the rocks, and the men climbing toward her. The blast kicked up a massive wall of dust and smoke, obscuring the ridge completely. The screaming started immediately, high, shrill sounds of men in agony. Elena pressed her face into the dirt, letting the debris rain down on her helmet. The dust cloud was thick, choking, and perfect. It was a curtain. Through the haze, the sound of the rotors became deafening. The Chinook flared over the valley floor, the rotor wash kicking up its own dust storm to mix with hers. The back ramp dropped. "Echo 4, loading, go, go!" the crew chief screamed over the comms. Elena watched through the thermal overlay of her fallen rifle. She could see the heat signatures of the Rangers scrambling up the ramp. They were dragging the wounded. They were safe. Then she saw one heat signature stop at the base of the ramp. It was O'Neill. He was looking up at the ridge, waving his arms. "Viper, move your ass! We're not leaving you!" O'Neill roared. Elena tried to push herself up. Her legs felt like rubber. She managed to get to her knees, but the world tilted sideways. She fell back against the rock. The blood loss was winning. The run to the LZ was 400 meters of treacherous, rocky descent. She couldn't walk, let alone run. If they waited for her, the dust would settle. The surviving enemy would regroup. The RPGs would fly. And everyone on that bird, the wounded Kalen, the kid Miller, the pilots, would burn. She looked at the radio on her chest. She keyed the mic, her thumb heavy and numb. "Get on the bird, Echo," she said, her voice finding a strange, calm strength. "I'm compromised. I can't make the run." "Negative. We wait," O'Neill screamed. "Pilot, hold position." "If you wait, you die," Elena said. She picked up her pistol, racking the slide against her holster with one hand. She looked down the slope. The dust was thinning. More heat signatures were appearing from the village. Reinforcements. "I am the rear guard," she said. "Forget about me. That is a direct order. Go." The ramp of the MH-47 Chinook was a gaping maw in the swirling dust storm. Through the green haze of her night vision, Elena watched the drama unfold 400 meters below. The giant tandem rotor helicopter was rocking violently, its wheels barely touching the uneven ground. Tracers from the far side of the village were beginning to arc toward it, angry red hornets stinging the armored skin of the aircraft. "Viper, I am sending a team up! Hold on!" O'Neill was screaming into the radio, his voice cracking with a mix of panic and fury. He was standing at the base of the ramp, physically blocking the crew chief from raising it. Elena slumped against the cold granite. Her vision was tunneling. The pain in her shoulder had dulled to a sickening throb, replaced by a numbness that was creeping down her chest. She checked her pistol, an M9 Beretta, one magazine in the well, 15 rounds. -2-1, Elena said. Her voice was weak, barely audible over the rotor wash. "You send a team, you lose the bird. Look at the tracers. They have the range." "I don't care. We don't leave people behind. That is the code." "The code is the mission," Elena countered, spitting blood onto the rocks. "The mission is the intel. You have it. Get it home." "Pilot, wait!" O'Neill yelled, his voice bleeding onto the general channel. "We are taking fire. Ramp up. Ramp up!" The pilot's voice cut in, sharp and terrified. "We are taking hits in the aft pylon. I'm lifting in 10 seconds with or without you." The Chinook's engines whined, the pitch increasing as the pilot applied power. The beast wanted to fly. O'Neill was still fighting, grabbing a fellow ranger's vest, pointing up the mountain. Elena closed her eyes for a second. They were good men, flawed, arrogant, loud, but loyal to a fault. They would die on this landing zone trying to save her, and the irony was bitter. She had spent the last 24 hours proving she didn't need their protection, and now their desire to protect her was going to kill them. She had to make the choice they couldn't. She looked at the radio unit clipped to her chest. The green light was blinking, the lifeline that connected her to the world, to safety, to the promise of a hot shower and a bed. "Goodbye, boys," she whispered. She didn't broadcast it. She simply unclipped the radio, heavy and brick-like, in her hand. She placed it on the flat rock beside her. She raised the grip of her pistol and brought it down hard on the display screen. Crunch. The plastic shattered. The green light flickered and died. The hiss of static in her earpiece vanished, replaced by the ringing silence of isolation. Down in the valley, the effect was immediate. O'Neill was shouting into a dead mic. He tapped his helmet, looked at his radio, then looked up at the ridge. He realized the line was dead. "We lost her signal," the pilot shouted. "She's gone! We have to go!" O'Neill froze. He stared up at the darkness where Elena was hidden. For a moment, he didn't move. Then the crew chief grabbed him by the back of his plate carrier and hauled him backward into the cargo bay. The ramp whined as it began to close. The Chinook lurched upward, dust billowing out in a massive mushroom cloud. The nose dipped and the helicopter gathered speed, banking hard to the west, away from the gunfire, away from the death trap, away from her. Elena watched it go. She watched the IR strobes fade into the distance until they were just stars moving against the backdrop of the mountains. The sound of the rotors faded. The wind took over. For the first time in hours, there was no radio chatter, no orders, no chaos, just the biting cold of the Hindu Kush and the realization that she was the only living thing on this ridge that wasn't hunting her. She tried to move her left arm and gasped, a fresh wave of nausea rolling over her. She checked the tourniquet. It was holding, but her skin was clammy. Shock was setting in. She pushed herself into a sitting position, her back against the stone. She held the M9 Beretta in her right hand, resting it on her knee. Below her, the enemy fire had stopped. They weren't shooting at the sky anymore. They knew the bird was gone. They knew who was left. She heard the sound of boots on shale, not the rhythmic march of a patrol, but the fast, excited scrambling of hunters who have cornered their prey. Voices called out in Pashto, close, terrifyingly close. Darye, halta! There, over there! Elena thumbed the safety off. She checked the chamber. Brass glinted in the moonlight. Just a girl, she murmured to the empty air, a sad smile touching her pale lips. She leveled the pistol at the gap in the rocks where the path emerged. She wouldn't die in the dark. She would make the muzzle flash light up the mountain one last time. The first shadow appeared over the jagged lip of the ridge. Elena didn't hesitate. She exhaled, centering the front sight of the Beretta on the dark shape, and squeezed the trigger. Pop, pop. The recoil was snappy, jarring her wounded shoulder. The shadow grunted, a wet, surprised sound, and tumbled backward down the scree. One, she counted, her voice a dry rasp. She shifted her aim to the left. Another figure tried to flank, moving low. She fired again. Dirt kicked up, and the figure scrambled back into cover. But they knew. They could hear the spacing of her shots. They could hear the desperation. Come on, she whispered, her vision blurring at the edges. Finish it. She looked at the pistol. The slide was still forward, but the weight told her she was light. Maybe 5 rounds left. Enough for 3 enemies, or 4 enemies and herself. The shouting in Pashto grew louder, angrier. They were done playing games. A grenade sailed over the rocks, landing 10 meters away. Elena curled into a fetal position, shielding her head. Boom! The concussion wave slapped her against the stone. Her ears, already ringing, went completely deaf. Dust coated her eyes. She felt shrapnel bite into her legs, but the pain was distant now, a dull data point in a system that was shutting down. She pushed herself up, blinking through the grit. They were rushing her, 3 of them, cresting the ridge simultaneously, silhouettes against the starlight. She raised the pistol. Click. She cleared the malfunction. Rack. Aim. Click. Empty. The slide locked back, exposing the barrel. The universal sign of defeat. Elena let the pistol drop from her hand. She slumped back against the cold granite, watching the men approach. They slowed down, seeing she was unarmed, seeing the blood soaking her uniform. Ideally, they would kill her. Realistically, they would want a trophy. She closed her eyes. She thought of the Chinook. By now, it was miles away, safe in the airspace over the border. Kalin was safe. Miller was safe. Mission accomplished. Then the ground began to vibrate. It wasn't the rhythmic thump of a helicopter. It was a low, guttural rumble that seemed to come from the core of the earth itself. The enemy fighters froze, looking up. Elena opened her eyes. She knew that sound. It was the sound of a chainsaw tearing through the sky. Warthog, she smiled, blood coating her teeth. The Rangers hadn't just left. They had screamed into their radios until someone listened. They had declared a broken arrow, unit overrun, and the Air Force had answered. An A-10, Thunderbolt Seku screamed over the valley floor, flying so low that the wake turbulence shook the dust off the rocks. The enemy fighters turned to run, terror replacing their bloodlust. But you don't outrun an A-10. Elena reached up to her helmet. Her fingers found the switch for her MS-2000 strobe light. She ripped the Velcro patch off her helmet and threw the strobe onto the rock in front of her. It pulsed with a blinding blue-white light, flashing once per second. I am the target, she thought. She didn't try to hide. She looked up at the sky as the jet banked hard, lining up for the strafing run. The pilot would see the strobe. He would see the enemy clustered around it, and he would do the math. Danger close. The nose of the A-10 dipped. Bert! The sound of the GAU-8 Avenger cannon was the sound of the apocalypse. A stream of 30mm depleted uranium shells, firing at 3,900 rounds per minute, tore into the ridge. The earth exploded. The rocks, the enemy, the darkness. Everything was consumed by a wall of fire and dust. Elena didn't feel the pain. She just felt the heat. And then the silence returned, absolute and eternal. 48 hours later. The sun was blindingly bright as the Quick Reaction Force, QRF, fast roped onto the ridge. Captain Kalin hit the ground first. He was moving stiffly, bandages visible under his collar, his face pale and drawn. He didn't wait for the perimeter to be set. He moved straight toward the blackened scar on the mountain. Careful, sir. Unexploded ordnance, a PJ, pararescue man, warned, following close behind. Kalin ignored him. He scrambled up the scree, his boots crunching on glass, sand that had been fused into crystal by the heat of the airstrike. The ridge was unrecognizable. The rock spire was gone, reduced to a crater. "Viper!" Kalin shouted, his voice cracking. "Elena!" The wind whistled through the devastation. There were no bodies. The 30mm cannon didn't leave bodies. It left biology. "Sir!" the PJ called out, kneeling near the edge of the crater. Kalin ran over. Lying in the dust, half buried under shale, was a rifle. It was an SR-25. The barrel warped from heat, the scope shattered. Next to it was a crushed radio and a burnt strip of nylon from a tourniquet. Kalin reached down, picking up the rifle. It was heavy, cold, and empty. "She held them here," Kalin whispered, looking at the pattern of brass casings scattered around the position. "She held the whole damn valley." "We need to find her, sir," the PJ said, scanning the area. "There's no body, no tags." Kalin looked out over the vast, rugged expanse of the Hindu Kush. The mountains rolled on forever, a sea of rock and secrets. If she had survived the blast, she had crawled into the labyrinth. If she hadn't, she was now part of the mountain. He clipped the broken rifle to his pack. He stood up, straightening his back, the weight of his own survival pressing down on him. "Mark the coordinates," Kalin said, his voice steady, finalizing. The report that would end his career and start a legend. "Action, enemy neutralized. U.S. forces, all account." He stopped. He looked at the empty space where she should have been. Status, missing in action. He turned back to the waiting helicopter. They would search. They would send drones. They would scour every cave. But deep down, Kalin knew the truth. Elena Vance wasn't just a girl, and she wasn't just a sniper. She was the ghost that would haunt these mountains, and his conscience forever. The dust settled, but the story was just beginning.